All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel, and we like to take you off the beaten path and introduce you to studies and literature and theories that you probably haven't heard of before. We've been doing a series of Bible decodes over the last few months. A lot of them have been coming from this book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult by Michael Menescotz, M-E-N-A-S-G-O-T-Z. This book just came out in the last year. Menescotz is one of many scholars who have been forwarding the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, or at least in his case, the Gospels. The Gospels were written by the Caesars, not by semi-literate fishermen and doctors in Judea, but by the Roman Caesars. And in particular, they were written by the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. That includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, that ruled the Roman Empire from 69 to 96 AD. They wrote the Gospels, and according to the theory, I'm not trying to convince you, I'm just going to present the evidence, but according to the theory, they wrote the Gospels and backdated the stories by 40 plus years. And then at the same time, they wrote a history, which is a history of a war that both Vespasian and Titus participated in. And this was called the War of the Jews, between the Romans and the Jews, that occurred from 66 to 73 AD. And this war kind of culminated over a century of unrest. Since the Romans pulled into Judea and took over, there were a long series of uprisings and revolts and wars and insurrections and revolutions that the Jews fought against the Romans. And the Romans were perfectly happy to kill the Jews, but it was kind of taxing on them because it spread them thin. They had so many other nations that they had to govern, and the Jews were like the most high maintenance because the Jews were willing to die for their beliefs. They had a jealous and zealous God who was, monotheistic, just one God. And this God also had obsessive compulsive disorder, and so he demanded that the Jews participate in all these rituals, including kosher food laws and circumcision and strictures against graven images and animal sacrifice, especially the Passover lamb sacrifice that had to be enumerated in Exodus 12 over many, many different details had to be kept to do the ritual properly. And the Romans weren't really having it. The Romans wanted to absorb you into their empire and absorb your religion. They were tolerant of your religion, but they thought that you should be tolerant of their religion. But the Jews' religion was separatist and xenophobic. They thought they were the chosen people and that their God was the only one. And so, it didn't go over very well when the Caesars tried to put a statue of one of them in the temple. That caused a total outbreak among many other outbreaks. And so the Roman Caesars, especially Vespasian and Titus, were sick and tired of dealing with the Jews. They knew the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, and the Jews were waiting for a Messiah who was a military commander, a Messiah who would kick the Romans out, expel the Romans by force. And really 3 candidates for the Jewish Messiah arose here in 66 AD, and they were named Simon, John, and Eleazar. And this is according to this history of the War of the Jews, which was written under the name of Josephus. Now, Josephus claimed to be a member of the family of the Flavians. He was known as Flavius Josephus, an adopted member of Vespasian's family, who was the court historian who lived at Caesar's palace in a townhouse and served as one of the court historians for the emperors. So Josephus was a Flavian. And in his history, he talks about Simon, John, and Eleazar, these Jewish zealots that rose up in 66 AD in Jerusalem and literally kicked out the Herods. I believe Herod Agrippa. And there were many, many different Herods, not just one. There was a whole dynasty of puppet rulers of Judea that were puppets of the Romans. So the Herods basically fled back to Rome, and Jerusalem was briefly under the control of these zealots, Simon, John, and Eleazar, these candidates for Jewish Messiah. Now, what happened was that Emperor Nero sent in the troops under the command of General Vespasian and tried to quell the revolt. Not so fast, though. Vespasian was there for 3 years before Nero was assassinated, and 3 other Roman emperors were assassinated, and Vespasian finally got the call to be the new emperor. So when he went to Rome to become the new emperor, he appointed his son Titus to become the new general to, restore order in Jerusalem. So basically, this war lasted 7 years, 3.5 under Vespasian and 3.5 under Titus. And after the war was over, both Titus and Vespasian were wounded in battle in this war. And they had just had it with the Jews, and, they went into their bag of psychological operations, psychological warfare, which was a hallmark of the Roman Caesars. And they wrote up a story about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack and turning the other cheek to oppression and believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and to exhort his God to forgive the Jews forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do, while at the very same time going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers who were changing out Roman coins with graven images on them for the Jewish coins, so that they could be brought into the temple for offering, and to disrupt the commerce of the Jews who were out there selling doves and pigeons and other animals for sacrifice for the rituals that were conducted in the temple. So Jesus is taking his shots at the Jews while being entirely deferential to the Romans, just as if he would if it was written by the Romans. And so that's kind of what the Romans' motive was. They also, it was right down the alley of their method of operation. The Romans were known to have created a number of other religions in this time period. Titus created at least 2 other religions. Vespasian also created another religion that was another operation on the Jews. But instead of being on the Jewish zealots, it was on the Pharisees. And this was called Rabbinical Judaism. And that was created by the Flavians. And so this was right down the wheelhouse of the Romans' method. In addition to that, other red flags are that the Gospels are written in Greek, which was the common language of the Roman Empire, but in particular in Rome. Many of the Roman royals also, spoke Latin and Greek as well. But in Judea, Greek was much more rare, being only for the upper crust of the elite. Literacy was very low in Judea compared to Rome as well. The Romans also had a monopoly on censorship. They had a monopoly on publishing. The Romans were the only people that had thousands of slaves who spent night and day copying texts over and over again, human copy machines that they called scribes. And the Romans had a monopoly on distribution. They had the only postal service in the Roman Empire that could spread these documents out to different places. But really, the Gospels were actually written as plays to be performed in front of the people, in particular the Jews, but then eventually also the Gentiles. Slaves and commoners and soldiers were also exposed to the story of Jesus, because Jesus was a good citizen and Jesus was deferential to the Romans. This is exactly the kind of citizen that the Romans wanted the Jews to be, and the Gentiles to be as well. So the way they did it is, or how you can tell that they did it. Now, I've presented mostly the circumstantial evidence, but the hard evidence that Menescats presents is that he looked at the parallels between this book by Josephus, War of the Jews, and the New Testament. And the parallels are inescapable. Whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the New Testament at the same time for the same reason. One example of a theme of parallels was that Titus had a 3-year military campaign in Judea from 70 to 73 AD. Jesus had a 3-year ministry in Judea from 30 to 33 AD. War of the Jews describes Titus's comings and goings of his military campaign, the various battles that he fought and the hardship and adventure that he faced against the Jews fighting these battles. And the War of the Jews documents the various, things that happened during Titus's campaign. The Gospels does the same with Jesus. And everywhere that Titus goes, Jesus also goes in the same order. They have the exact same campaigns. And at each location, they participate in parallel events. The events are not exactly the same, but they are parallels. They are typologically the same or conceptually the same. And there are many. It's not just a couple places. I don't know how many it is. Joseph Atwill marked down, I believe, like 46 events that are in the same order in both stories. In his book, Caesar's Messiah, the Flavian signature edition. And Menescot's found far more than that. He dug into the book of Luke, looking for parallels. Another set of parallels was that many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews, mainly by Titus, which makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. So you can put away your Apocalypse of John, known as Revelation, that you're waiting for the second coming of Jesus. But if you read War of the Jews, you would know that it's already happened 1,950 years ago. If you believe that. But what Menescot's really lays bare is that both the New Testament, the Gospels, and War of the Jews are fictional. And both Jesus and Josephus are fictional. Josephus was probably a whole team of researchers and writers, probably led by this guy named Arius Piso, who was kind of like the shadow emperor under Vespasian and Titus, kind of like the Henry Kissinger of his time. And they were probably assisted by a lot of the Herods, who had a lot of Jewish ancestry. Herods may have actually been related to the Maccabees, who also were Jewish zealots that overthrew the Seleucids, which were the Syrian Greek rulers of Judea in the 2nd century BC. And so the Herods probably helped out with a lot of the technicalities, the prophecies, and so on that come from the Old Testament to put them into this New Testament story. Now, what Menescot's does, he digs in, and in particular the book of Luke, looking for parallels with the War of the Jews, and he found at least 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. That is over 10 per chapter. I believe every single chapter has at least 6 parallels. And not only that, but he graphed them out on a chart. Put the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every time he found a parallel, he put a dot on the chart. After plotting all 250 parallels, or 250 dots, he found that he had written 5 near-perfect letters of the same size in Latin, the language of the Roman royals, of the Caesars. So those letters are APTVS, which I believe stands for Arius, Piso, Titus, Vespasianus. But certainly the TVS is Titus Vespasianus, the 2 emperors that were involved and they use that same imprint on Roman coins from the period. So it's not just like a made-up supposition that they would use them here in the book of Luke. So basically, the Romans, not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they signed their name to it because they wanted you to know that they wrote it at some point in the distant future. They didn't want to be found out in their lifetime, but I could lay odds that they didn't think that it was going to last 2,000 years before somebody figured it out. And it didn't, because many people have figured it out over the years, including a laundry list of the greatest authors of all time who stated it, especially William Shakespeare, who was this woman named Amelia Bassano, and every one of Shakespeare's plays is on this subject. And then many historians have also figured this out, but it hasn't really gotten the kind of play until the 21st century with the work of Joseph Atwill and his book Caesar's Messiah. Okay, now Menescats is going over here the statistical probabilities. He goes over all 250 parallels. We've kind of covered most of them already, but now he's talking about the specifics of the odds of that something like this would be a coincidence. And in particular right now he's looking at the odds of these 21 events that both War of the Jews and the Gospels link to Exodus 12, which is the Passover lamb ritual. There are 21 different events in both War of the Jews and in the New Testament that indicate that the Passover lamb ritual is being followed in both books. Okay, so he says, step one, the odds that both stories evoke each of these 21 Exodus 12 concepts at least once and at most twice. It would be very difficult to calculate the probability that a random section of a document would evoke a specific Old Testament concept by chance. For example, the requirement to prepare the sacrifice using hyssop, or indeed the odds of specifically 1 to 2 paragraphs doing so. But as it turns out, we can put an upper limit on that probability. Jewish War has 694 paragraphs, which mostly are broadly comparable in length. If the odds of any specific paragraph evoking this concept were less than 1 in 1,000, you'd be most likely to get no matches. But if the odds were much greater, at say 1 in 10, you'd probably get lots of matches. In both scenarios, getting 1 to 2 matches is improbable. It turns out that the odds of getting 1 to 2 matches peaks when each paragraph has a 20%, 0.2%, or 1 in 500 chance of evoking a concept in Exodus 12. This is not hard to calculate, and all we need to do is identify the maximum probability achievable, which turns out to be 59%. I'm kind of lost on where he's going with this. If it is quite likely that a paragraph would match the concept, then we would get a large number of matches, and getting 1 to 2 matches becomes increasingly likely. And if it is very rare or unlikely for a paragraph to evoke that concept, then we are unlikely to get 1 to 2 matches. There is a sweet spot where 1 to 2 matches are most likely, but even in this circumstance, the odds of it happening are only 59%. If it's 1 in 500. Okay, 59%. So that's the number that he's going to, I think, take to the 21st power to figure this out. Okay. The upshot is that if, and you can see on the thumbnail, you can see the entire diagram for reference. And the blue dots are where the New Testament is parodying Josephus, and the black dots are where Josephus is parodying the Gospels. And I think the other colored dots, I don't know if they're red or green, but those are the ones that are related to this Passover lamb ritual. I believe there's about 40 of those. The upshot is that if a critic wishes to argue that these parallels are coincidental and unintended, then no matter what value they wish to posit for how likely such an event actually is, whether it be 1 in 50 or 1 in a million, the odds of it happening specifically once or twice cannot be more than 59%. So 59% is the maximum. Indeed, we can do the same calculation for Luke, which has 1,151 verses, or he calls them sections, rather than 694 paragraphs in Josephus. If the odds of a verse matching a random Old Testament concept were extremely low, you'd get no matches. And if they were high, you'd get too many matches. And again, as with Jewish war, the odds of Luke evoking a random Exodus 12 concept specifically once or twice could be as high as 59%. This matters because both stories, Luke and Jewish war, unambiguously evoke all 21 of the required Exodus 12 steps, specifically once or twice, with nothing present to suggest this was intentional. The odds of this are easily calculated as 59% multiplied by itself 20 times, or 0.59 to the 21st power. This suggests the odds cannot be greater than 1 in 65,000. Of course, the real odds are probably far lower. Not only have I been conservative in only claiming there to be 21 parallels with Exodus 12 rather than 40, but also the odds of a random paragraph of text or a random verse of a gospel being a match with a random Old Testament concept is probably much less than 1 in 500. Would you really expect every 500th paragraph of a random history document to mention, say, the concept of striking doors or a sacrifice with hyssop, yet without the text talking about those requirements of Passover? It's definitely not reasonable to think that all of the required steps in Exodus 12 have the same probability of specifically 1 in 500 of being subtly evoked in any paragraph of a first-century historical document. That's deeply unreasonable. But merely to be conservative, let's stick with those numbers anyway, giving the odds as, at most, 1 in 65,000. This is still sufficient that we can comfortably rule out that the steps of Exodus 12 were subtly evoked in the two stories as merely a series of coincidences. Now, and this is only those 40 parallels of the Exodus 12 where both Josephus and Luke are paralleling, evoking the same concepts that are the process of doing a sacrifice of a lamb for Passover. So this is not including all those hundreds of other rituals. Hundreds of other parallels. Okay. Let's see if I'm on the correct page here. Yeah, all right. Okay, step 2, calculating the odds that, assuming Jewish war and Luke evoke these 21 concepts from Exodus 12 once or twice, when their locations are plotted, all 21 resulting dots would align perfectly with the APTVS pattern. In this section, I will set aside how improbable it is for each story to evoke each required act of Exodus 12 once or twice, and instead focus on the probability that when we plot them, they all align with the APTVS pattern. For a graphical illustration of how these two patterns align, you can look at the chart here, which I'm not really going to show you, but he says there is no opportunity to argue about the locations of these 21 parallels, yet all of them align to the APTVS pattern. If they were the result of coincidences, not only would they not be clustered together, but each one would have a 1 in 4 chance of aligning with the pattern, because the pattern only fills 1 out of 4, approximately 25% of the whole diagram. So 75% of the diagram is not part of the pattern. He used this same probability when figuring this out before with a different set of probabilities. Okay, but each one would have 1 in 4 chance of aligning with the pattern identified by the mutually opposed parities. As discussed earlier, the VS was probably the original pattern. And you can see the VS is much more well developed than the A and the P and the T as well. So the Vespasian part probably came first, especially when you consider that War of the Jews is a history of a war that occurred in 66 to 73 AD. But the story of War of the Jews starts in like 150 BC. So those first 3 books or so out of the 7 volumes are all kind of introductory material and could have easily been added at a later date. And so I think that might have been what happened, that Vespasian did this with the VS, and then maybe Titus added to it with the T, and then maybe Domitian or some Arius Piso or somebody else added to that with the AP. And this is also important to note that the parallels in the VS are much more well developed. The parallels are well hidden, thoughtful, in sometimes genius, and very enigmatic, like a riddle, like you have to figure it out. And this is something that the Romans, loved. This was entertainment for them, to figure out codes and riddles, and to kind of, the whole thing is very mean-spirited against the Jews. They're mocking and ridiculing the Jews throughout. And so this would have been very entertaining to be reading at court for the Roman Caesars, to make fun of the Jews and like see all of the little riddles and jokes that are ridiculing them that most people